Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give it a few minutes, let people roll into the room here before we get started, so please just be patient. Again, everyone, just going to wait one more minute to allow for attendees to roll into the room. We will get started momentarily, so please just be patient with us. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to run through a few housekeeping items before we get started. First off, this webinar is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be sent out later this week. Closed captioning has been enabled. If you need that, please feel free to turn it on. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please utilize the Q&A box to ask those questions. We will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And also, if you have any additional needs around accessibility testing, etc., please reach out to ida@tpgi.com. Again, that's ida@tpgi.com. And we'll be happy to connect you with one of our account executives to answer any questions that you have. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to David Swallow, who's here to present on If Memory Serves, creating unforgettable user experiences.
Okay, thank you very much and welcome to the webinar. Yeah, I'm David Swallow and I'm Principal UX Consultant at TPGI. So today I'm going to be exploring how we design for a poor memory and what we can do to create unforgettable user experiences. I just want to be honest and upfront. This is something of a work in progress. It's a completely new area to me, so I'm kind of learning as I go. So if anything seems not quite right or underdeveloped, then that's probably why. And feel free to tell me afterwards if there's any glaring errors or anything you think I should explore further. Okay, so I'd like to begin by asking for a quick show of hands, and I'm not sure how easy this will be in a webinar. Using the put the hand up facility, could I have a quick show of hands if you consider yourself to have a good memory? Let's see if this works. Wow.
It looks like it, and I'm seeing a lot of hands going up
Yeah.
now.
Well, it's a lot. Yeah. Okay, and equally, could you reset the hands, please, Kerry? Could you put your hands up if you have a poor memory for whatever reason? You consider yourself to have a poor memory.
We're getting quite a few more of those.
Yeah. Okay, good to know. Yeah, whenever I've asked this before, I usually find that most people consider themselves to have a poor memory. So if that is you, the good news is, well, you're clearly not alone. The bad news is I've got nothing to help or improve your memory in any way. But what I do have are various things we can do to make the web easier to use for someone with memory loss. I'm just going to turn my camera off just so it doesn't slow down. I'll be back at the end. Okay, so you might be wondering what counts as a poor memory. Well, there's no real way to give a truly accurate measurement of memory. Psychologists use different methods depending on the goal of their research. The most common ways of measuring memory performance are what's called production tests, which involve recall, and recognition tests that involve the selection of correct from incorrect information. So let's just take a quick look at this. If I were to ask you, you don't have to put your hands in there. If I were to ask you who wrote Moby Dick, this is a recall test because you would use a process of recall to retrieve the correct answer from your memory. But if I was to ask you, did Herman Melville write Moby Dick? That is a recognition test because all you have to do is recognize whether the information provided is correct. Recognition is generally easier than recall because it involves more cues. And it's the reason why multiple choice questions are easier than open-ended questions, where you've got to come up with an answer from scratch. So from recall and recognition tests, you get a score, which could then be measured against the rest of the population. And that would give you an objective indication of memory retention. So that's kind of how you do it scientifically. But as we've seen, most of us will just have a hunch about how good or bad our memory is. And I should point out this is vastly simplified. And there are many other facets of memory. But as we'll see, recognition and recall is most relevant to UI and UX design. So people can have a poor memory for all sorts of reasons. I've put a list of just some of these on the slide, but some of the more common causes include stress, anxiety, or depression. So these have been linked to memory problems such as forgetfulness or confusion. And they can also make it difficult to focus on work or other tasks, making decisions or just thinking clearly. Dementia. So this tends to be what everyone thinks of when we talk about memory loss. And dementia is caused by damage to the brain, and this damage can affect areas of the brain involved in creating and retrieving memories. COVID, and in particular long COVID, is something that's increasingly associated with memory loss and brain fog. A recent study on non-hospitalized COVID-19 patients observed that 11% reported memory problems 8 months after recovery. You might have your own experiences of things like that. Baby brain, which is a real thing. Forgetfulness and mental fogginess are commonly reported in pregnant and new parents. It's thought to originate from a change in hormones, as well as the stress and fatigue from having a baby. And there's simply old age. So as we grow older, changes occur in all parts of the body, including the brain. As a result, some people notice that they perhaps don't remember information as well as they once did and aren't able to recall it as quickly. An age-associated memory impairment is considered to be a normal part of aging. It doesn't mean you have dementia. So those are just some of the causes of memory loss, and it's in no way exhaustive. Now, obviously, for some people, memory loss is incredibly disabling, but what I'm trying to stress is that most people experience some degree of memory loss at some stage in their life. So given the prevalence of poor memory or forgetfulness, this got me thinking, wondering whether there's anything about the web that presents a particular problem for people with memory impairments, and equally whether there's anything that we as UI, UX designers and developers can do to better support people with memory loss. Now, I'm not the first person to consider this. Memory's been a usability consideration for many years. Recognition rather than recall is the 6th heuristic guideline established by Jakob Nielsen in his General Principles for Interaction Design, which was published 30 years ago in 1994. It promotes the design of interfaces with items that people can quickly identify and recognize instead of recalling them from scratch. Memory limitations have also been the basis of a number of myths that have unduly influenced UX design. One of these is Miller's magical number 7 plus or minus 2, or Miller's law. And Miller's law is a cognitive psychology principle that states that the average person can only hold about 7 plus or minus 2 items in their working memory at a time. And this is also known as the magic number 7. And this was seized upon by UI and UX designers to justify unnecessary design limitations, particularly when it comes to the number of things, like the number of items in a menu, or the number of items on a slider, or the number of links on a home page. And that's not the case. The law only applies to the amount of information that humans can juggle in their working memory. It doesn't apply to information that's readily available to be read, that you don't need to store in working memory. So on a web page, the information is visually present. People don't have to memorize anything and can therefore manage broader choices than 7. And numerous studies have debunked it, but it's strangely persistent. Even Miller himself referred to it as a bit of a joke. Now, although memory has featured in the usability literature, it isn't something that's been traditionally covered by accessibility resources. Until very recently, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, didn't make any reference to memory. However, new success criteria in WCAG 2.1 and 2.2 have started to address aspects of cognitive accessibility. Much of this has been spearheaded by the W3C's Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Accessibility Task Force, known as COGA. Just for full disclosure, I'm a member of COGA. COGA is working to produce guidance that addresses the cognitive space, including memory limitations. One of its publications, which provides design patterns and techniques, is called Making Content Usable for People with Cognitive and Learning Disabilities. And amongst other things, this promotes the creation of interfaces to support people with memory limitations. So those are some of the resources I'm going to be drawing on today. So almost 3 years ago, like all good researchers, I took the very scientific approach of turning to Twitter, X, if you like, and posted, do you have a poor memory for whatever reason, maybe tiredness, stress or anxiety, illness, or age? If so, is there anything about using the web that is a help or hindrance? Hashtag A11Y. This generated a surprising number of responses, and it confirmed to me that it was something that impacts many people. I then let the topic sit for a bit, mainly due to the pandemic, and when I returned to it, when putting this talk together, I discovered that many of the people who had responded on Twitter had since, for good reason, either deleted their account or restricted their tweets, meaning that I couldn't see the replies anymore. So that was very frustrating. So I asked again, this time on Mastodon. As my friend Andrew pointed out, the irony that you're asking this again because responses were impermanent and you can't remember what they said is not lost on me. Something I noticed is that memory loss is not the easiest subject to discuss, as it has a lot of emotional connotations for some people. And also it's hard to perceive where an interface might be letting you down in some way. As a result, many people, perhaps predictably, cited the difficulty of remembering passwords and the use of password managers to help with this. So there we go, job done. Password managers are the solution. End of talk. Anyway, I went on to ask about it on dedicated discussion forums and message boards, and then got talking to people with some degree of memory loss in quite different circumstances. And from this, several common themes emerged. And as I discovered, there's so much more to it than passwords. Just have a quick drink. So yeah, unsurprisingly, when it comes to memory, one of the first things that comes to people's minds are passwords and the difficulties of remembering them. So have you forgotten your password is a familiar refrain on the web, where the onus is on us to remember all manner of usernames, IDs, passwords, and pins. So passwords are problematic for people with memory impairment. They'll often forget their passwords and not be able to log in, something I'm sure most of us can identify with. As a result, they come up with workarounds that pose a security risk. So they might use a simple to remember password, which is often simple to guess, or they may end up reusing the same password in different places. They may also store their password insecurely, such as in a text file or by writing it down on a piece of paper. And that's just with standard password entry. Sometimes you're required to enter certain characters of a password. You might be sent a PIN and have to copy it from your email or another device. You might have to complete a puzzle or identify distorted letters. And you might only have a limited amount of time to complete it in, or a limited number of attempts before you're locked out. So one of the people I spoke to with memory loss had this to say. Everything wants a password now. At work, I've got a password to log onto my computer, the virtual desktop, my email, Teams, various databases, and external websites. If I'm hot desking and I get given a new machine, it doesn't have my passwords saved, so I have to try and remember them. Inevitably, some of my passwords end up being the same because I don't have the capacity to remember 10 different passwords. But doing that seems slightly safer than writing them all down. But it's not just remembering passwords, it's setting them in the first place. We're cajoled into coming up with increasingly secure and increasingly complex passwords, not to mention we are encouraged, sometimes forced, to change our passwords frequently and warned not to use the same password in more than one place. One respondent, again with memory issues, said, some sites have strict requirements, like they require a special character or can't end with a number, and I can never remember which do. I am thankful for password managers because of this, but it is still a stress point for me. So yeah, password managers were cited by many respondents as a huge help. If you're unfamiliar with them, password managers help by storing all your passwords securely, so you don't have to worry about remembering them. This allows you to use unique, strong passwords for all your important accounts, rather than using the same password for all of them, which you should never do. The beauty of password managers is that they allow you to effectively offload your brain and let technology take the strain. The blogger Tom Mewett described the cognitive benefits that this brings to him. He said, I started using a password manager, not for generating passwords, as I like to use memorable ones, but just so I felt like I could forget them. That feeling of knowing you can forget something, but still recall it later from something written down, alleviates a weight from your subconscious, which is hard to describe. However, password managers are not without problems. Since password managers store all the users' passwords in one place, they become a single point of failure. If you lose your master password, you might lose access to all your passwords at once. Likewise, if a bad actor gains access to the password manager, they can potentially gain access to all your accounts. As one respondent put it, how do you know they're secure? If someone hacks into a password manager, they've got everything. I'm safer writing it down in a little notebook because the chances of that getting stolen are far less than my computer getting hacked. Not all password managers work across every device, platform, or web browser. Similarly, password managers don't always work correctly across all websites. They might not recognize that a login's been requested, or they might not autofill a login form. One respondent said, password managers help, but only if they work on every platform and every site and are updated every time a password changes, which has not been my experience. Just out of interest, using the hands thing, put your hand up. Who uses a password manager here? If you just pop your hand up again. Okay. So yeah, fair few. Cool. Just interested. Some sites go out of their way to make the use of password managers difficult. Many respondents mentioned that one of their biggest frustrations was sites that prevent paste or autofill in password fields. This, of course, makes it impossible to use a password manager. The good news is that restrictions on copying and pasting passwords have been addressed to some extent in the latest version of WCAG. So WCAG considers remembering a password or transcribing it from one place to another to be a cognitive function test, and outlaws these in 2 new success criteria concerning accessible authentication. And allowing users to paste in passwords rather than transcribe them is an accepted mechanism, as they refer to it. And platforms have also introduced their own mechanisms to tackle this issue. A very popular one is Apple's paste from text message or email feature, which several respondents mentioned. One said, the ability to paste login codes from text messages without changing context is an awesome help. So despite some limitations, it's clear that password managers are beneficial for anyone, but particularly people with memory impairments. But in order for people to use them effectively, we need to make sure that our websites and apps don't make it unnecessarily difficult. So one of the key things is don't prevent users from copying and pasting into forms. It doesn't have any security advantages. As I mentioned earlier, WCAG recently introduced new success criteria pertaining to security. There's 3.3.8 accessible authentication minimum, which is level AA, and 3.3.9 accessible authentication enhanced, which is AAA, and that's a slightly stricter version. The purpose of these success criteria are to ensure there's an accessible, easy to use, and secure method to log in. Another thing that makes the job of password managers a bit easier is to make sure forms and form controls are marked up properly with correctly associated labels, and using the appropriate input type, type is password or type text, can also increase the chances of password managers identifying password fields. Hidde de Vries did a good blog post on making password managers play ball with your login form. That's well worth a read. You can also use the Web Authentication API to allow users to authenticate with their device, with their phones, laptops, whatever it is, instead of username and password. Ultimately, you're trying to avoid processes such as password authentication that rely on people's memory to complete them. Okay, so another common theme that respondents mentioned pertained to finding stuff on the web. So many respondents with memory issues cited search facilities as a big help. And this included search engines and website search facilities, as well as the find in page browser search. So people with memory impairments might find browsing a site and going from page to page to look for content difficult. And if the process takes too long, they might forget what they were looking for. So having a search facility allows users to find the content they need, even if they cannot browse to it through the website. One respondent said, I can search and bookmark anything, words, names, emails, code that I've forgotten. No need to stress my puny brain. This perhaps seems counterintuitive, as search requires users to generate query terms from scratch using recall memory. As one respondent put it, you can't get an answer if you don't know the question. And this is true. But if you can overcome that step, from then on, users can rely on recognition while reviewing the search results. And recognition's helped further when search facilities provide autocomplete, suggestions, or filters that allow users to formulate their query and narrow down the results. One respondent found it difficult when search functions are too strict, as they might not remember the exact word or phrase that they're looking for. One said, it's frustrating when I'm shopping for groceries online and I get no result because I haven't used the exact same term that they use, like J-cloths instead of all-purpose cloths. Rather than me asking me, did you mean? I have to try out different search terms until I find out what I'm looking for. Another respondent described how they often go back to Google rather than to use a site's own search facility, as Google is usually much more flexible and reliable. And Google is often more forgiving. It corrects misspellings, it finds relevant content, and it makes those auto-corrected suggestions. Did you mean? Although I notice that Google now tends to just show you what it thinks you mean with an option to use your original query. Search facilities that are accommodating is one thing, but for search to be effective, the underlying content has got to be structured in such a way that it allows it to be searched. So if information is not stored in an easily searchable way, it can be difficult to retrieve. Several respondents pointed out the frustration when information can't be easily searched. One respondent referred to virtual or hidden content that doesn't pop up in a finding page search. Another respondent referred to content being locked in infographics and PDF files that can't be easily searched. One respondent was frustrated by too much reliance on video content, such as online tutorials that can't be easily searched, noting that it creates difficulty for people with short-term memory issues. And yes, there's been many times when I wanted to find out how to do something trivial in Excel or a bit of DIY, and then being forced to watch a 10-minute video. And, the text would just be easier. We tend to think about search in terms of finding a website or finding a particular page within a website, but several respondents talked about searching their own search and browsing history. And one respondent described how, when I have trouble remembering something, I think about when I was looking at it and check out my browser history around that time. It's difficult when the page title is the same for many URLs, like on Facebook or Instagram. In addition to making the content searchable, make sure websites are well titled, and that will make it easier for people to track down what they were looking for. And people with cognitive disabilities, limited short-term memory and reading disabilities also benefit from the ability to identify content by its title. Page titles are covered by WCAG in 2.4.2, page titled, which requires web pages to have titles that describe topic or purpose. But as websites evolve into things like single page applications and mobile apps, the concept of a page title is becoming less reliable. So although it might seem counterintuitive, search is a very effective method for people with memory limitations to find what they were looking for on the web. As we've seen, users have developed their own technological strategies and workarounds to assist with search. But for search to be effective, it's dependent on the underlying content being clear, well-structured, and preferably text-based. So ensure search facilities provide relevant results. Don't be too strict, accept close variations of search terms, provide search suggestions, autocomplete, or filters, narrow down the query and the results. Consider the presentation of search results. So a busy page of search results containing long lists of links can be overwhelming for people with memory limitations. So if there are many results from related topics, it can help to present the results under the appropriate headings and categories. So a way of breaking it up. Ensure content's easily searchable. So avoid locking text away in images and PDFs and videos. And provide unique page titles that describe topic or purpose. So this is good advice in general, but it's particularly useful when searching one's own history. Okay. Another common theme that respondents mentioned pertains to navigation and getting around the web. And this includes navigating between web pages as well as within web pages. It involves remembering where you've been, remembering where you want to go, remembering how to get there, and how to get back again. So complex, poorly structured websites can be difficult to navigate for people with memory impairment. As one respondent put it, simple interface is good, complex interface is bad. Users can become lost and confused when they don't understand the hierarchy of a website or app, or when the page structure is unclear. They might not complete tasks and will likely miss information. Plus, they'll be reluctant to return to pages that are complicated to use and understand. Website categories rely on your ability to recall what is contained within them. One respondent with memory loss described how they struggle when trying to find items on shopping sites where taxonomies are a bit of a mess. Was it a men's top or a men's pullover, for example? One person I spoke to who has early onset dementia said the key thing for them is simplicity. Where you want to get to being one click away and not a myriad of clicks. Often, if you get lost on a website, that in itself means there's been too many clicks. So a back home button is useful. Several respondents mentioned the difficulties posed by multi-page forms. So this might be something like purchasing a product where you've got separate pages for billing, delivery, payment, and so on. Or it might be something more involved, like applying for a passport or a government website. One respondent described how completing something like a tax return can be quite overwhelming and anxiety-inducing when you're in the middle of it with no indication of where you are in the process, what you've already entered, and how much there is to go. Another respondent said, multi-screen order processes that don't include the full details of the order on each screen I find really confusing. And I often have to restart the process to check I did what I think I did. Now, this surprised me, as multi-page forms are generally considered good practice. The W3C's tutorial on forms states, where possible, divide long forms into multiple smaller forms that constitute a series of logical steps or stages. This helps make long forms less daunting and easier to understand, particularly for people who are less experienced using computers or who have various cognitive disabilities. And the gov.uk design manual also encourages one thing per page for similar reasons. But I think what's crucial is indicating progress. Provide an indication at the start of how many steps are involved and an estimate of the amount of effort that's required to complete the task. Tell people how long the process might take and provide details of any resources, such as documents or information that they'll need. And keep users informed of the process, how many steps they've completed and how many there is to go, where they are currently. And avoid users having to hold information in their heads across multiple pages, whether it's form instructions or details of an order. Just repeat it on each page so people know where they are. Or labeling can make it difficult to get around on the web if you have a memory impairment. When labels on controls are missing or unclear, users might not know that a feature is available or what a control does. And even if someone with memory impairment figures out what an unlabeled control does, or is perhaps shown by someone else, they might not remember it from one session to the next. So labels need to be visible. They need to be correctly associated with their control, both visually and programmatically, so they can be read by assistive technologies, and they need to accurately describe the purpose of the control. One respondent mentioned the difficulty of icons in this regard. If the icon is not accompanied by a text label as well, they can be difficult to understand. Now, well-designed icons aid recognition, and once understood, users are typically faster with icons than text labels. However, no icon is universally recognized, so providing a text label as well helps users to learn its purpose. Labels also need to be permanent. So the use of placeholder text for labels can be very difficult for someone with memory issues due to the text disappearing when the user starts typing something. So to illustrate this, here's an example from an add a credit card stage of a purchasing flow. Now, each of the fields are labeled with placeholder text, which disappears upon entry. This makes it very difficult to remember which field is which, particularly when fields have formatting requirements like the expiry there. So on this one, they start entering something into the field and the placeholder text disappears, and then they wonder what the formatting requirements were, but they can't see it, so they have to delete it, which brings back the placeholder label, and then they can enter the correct format. So avoid relying on placeholder text. As with security and search, respondents mentioned a number of technological strategies to assist with navigation, many of them browser-based. So the humble browser back button is important in allowing people to remember where they've been and to help them get there. One respondent stressed the importance of a working back button that helps keep your progress. Many respondents said they rely on various save for later or favorite or good old browser bookmarks to keep a record of where they've been. And many respondents don't bother with bookmarks, but instead leave multiple, and I mean multiple, browser tabs open, almost as a sort of breadcrumb trail, or as one described it, a to-do list that frees up working memory. So the screenshot on the slide is perhaps a little extreme, but it's not far off the mark. One respondent described having 200 to 300 tabs open at any one time. Your experiences may be similar. Browser tabs were described as a huge help, with one respondent specifically praising the browser performance features that allow many tabs to be open without consuming resources. As one respondent explained, I'll never remember the journey back to some sites, but also sometimes it's creating, say, a narrative. These tabs that are all in X window are all about this half-finished project, and all the tabs in Y window are about some other thing I've got to do. I've got all the bits I need in roughly the order I'll need them when I sit down to do the thing. Okay, so for many people, but particularly people with memory limitations, the structure and organization of websites needs to be logical and understandable to make it easy to find what they need. So create logical website structure. Divide the site into clear logical sections, make the category structure and headings easy to understand, make navigation clear and explicit, and signpost a clear route back to the home page. In multi-step processes, give clear feedback on progress and on completion. Make it clear where you are in the process, what you've already entered, how much there is still to go. Provide clear, visible labeling of links, buttons, and form fields, and don't rely on placeholder text. And support browser features such as bookmarking, opening in new tabs, and don't break the back button. And the final theme that respondents have mentioned pertains to distractions. So anything which creates an interruption and breaks your flow can impact severely upon memory. So one of the major causes of distractions that many respondents mentioned was pop-ups and modal dialogues. So one respondent said about modals, they pop up and interrupt what I'm thinking about or doing. It's like the digital version of not knowing why you walked in a room. They're awful when I'm stressed out or exhausted. Another respondent said that modals were particularly problematic when they're out of context and have nothing to do with your current task. One respondent criticized prompts to review or give feedback, which they described as interrupting process for cheap metrics. A particular type of pop-up was everyone's favorite, cookie consent banners, or as one respondent referred to them, GDPR hell UIs, which are a very imposing UI pattern that can increase cognitive load. One respondent said GDPR active consent for cookies is a huge distraction and disproportionately places a huge cognitive burden on older, more nervous users. Another respondent said, cookies, by the time I've turned them off, I can't remember why I'm there. On a similar note, several respondents pointed to the visual effects that can cause sensory overload and sap concentration. One respondent described how visual movement triggers mind blanks. Anything that plays automatically, either video or audio, can be very distracting and cause people to lose their train of thought. One respondent mentioned auto-playing video pop-ups that you often get on news sites, which often have nothing to do with the main article. This is a typical example from a UK news site where you've got an auto-playing video distracting you from the main content. And I don't know if you've noticed, but it's the big Pet Saver event at Pets at Home this weekend. And those adverts are continually cycling around. They surround the entire page. There are also inline video ads just below the fold. Yeah, the story itself is something of an afterthought. Another respondent mentioned the automatic timeline refresh that often occurs on Twitter and LinkedIn, which causes you to lose your place and forget what you were doing. So you might be halfway through reading a post when suddenly it's replaced with a completely different, often promoted post with no way of getting back to what you were reading. And the design and presentation of text was cited by several respondents, with one complaining about the current trend towards low contrast everything. This seems a bit of a contradiction as well, that low contrast is causing a visual distraction. But yeah, it was mentioned by quite a few respondents. In the latest WebAIM Million report on the accessibility of the top 1 million homepages, low contrast text was the most commonly detected accessibility issue, found on 83.6% of homepages. Cognitive disabilities that impact memory and the ability to maintain focus also make using hard to see text extremely difficult. One respondent said, "My memory is toast due to narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia, robbing me of restful sleep. The low contrast of my mail client makes each panel textural noise that frazzles my brain." Another respondent described how tight line height and poor use of variable fonts were a hindrance, as was info that is too much or too long. And in an intersection with my anxiety work, and this is another chance to see an old slide here, several respondents mentioned the pressure caused by time limits and the impacts they have on memory. One respondent said, "The worst thing about using the internet when my memory is an issue is time limits. Time limits are often used deceptively on websites to hurry people into making a purchase. They're also used legitimately, often for security reasons, things like passcode generators. Sometimes you'll have a countdown before automatically being logged out. Sometimes you'll be logged out without warning, which can also be incredibly jarring. Time limits are distracting and can provoke feelings of anxiety, which all impacts on our cognitive load. Now, the only solutions that respondents mentioned for dealing with visual distractions involved finding a way to turn them off or override them. So pop-up blockers and ad blockers were commonly cited as ways of dealing with annoying requests to sign up for newsletters, subscription offers, accept notifications, review your product, chat to an AI chatbot, and so on. Even cookie consent banners can apparently be suppressed with certain browser extensions. Excuse me, just having a cough. And when that doesn't work, several respondents described using reading mode in browsers to aid concentration, as it strips away the website's formatting, empty space, ads, and all the other distracting elements to help you concentrate on the text. And respondents also mentioned a number of strategies to aid concentration involving making use of text spacing controls and contrast modes. So as ever, there are some technological workarounds, but there's much we can do to avoid these attention-grabbing distractions in the first place. Ideally, we need to avoid creating unnecessary distractions wherever possible. But where that isn't possible, there needs to be an easy way of turning off distractions. So we see this in WCAG with 2.2.2 pause, stop, hide, which requires authors to provide a way for users to pause, stop, or hide any moving, blinking, scrolling, or auto-updating information. Avoid unnecessary pop-ups and modal dialogues, and certainly avoid modals that are irrelevant to the task at hand, such as advertising within a checkout flow or nagging prompts to review a product. And where that's not possible, give users control to easily dismiss, mute, or turn off pop-ups. Avoid auto-playing content. And again, if you must autoplay content, then provide an easy, accessible way to pause or stop the content. And that's particularly important for flashing content that could trigger seizures. Provide warnings up front and make that opt-in. Don't leave it up to the user to turn off flashing content, as it may be too late. Remove unnecessary time limits and countdown timers. Give users enough time to comfortably complete their tasks, or give users control to turn off, adjust, or extend time limits. And make content easy to read. Choose an appropriate font size, line length, and line height, and provide sufficient color contrast. Or give users control to override these styles. And finally, if users lose focus and forget what they're doing, clear headings and breadcrumbs and page titles can help reorient and refocus. So bringing things to a close, we've seen some of the difficulties that people with memory loss encounter on the web. We've also seen how we can design for a poor memory and create unforgettable user experiences. Using the web with memory loss is more complicated than remembering passwords. Equally, designing for a poor memory is more than just using password managers. It's about making the web easier to navigate and helping users find what they're looking for. It's about reducing distractions and allowing users to concentrate. And it's about keeping websites and the content within them clear and easy to understand. As I mentioned at the start, memory and cognitive load has for a long time been considered a mere usability matter. And certainly much of the advice I've shared today is good usability for most people. But for some people, it's an accessibility matter. And heck, it's a health matter. And as is often the case with accessibility, there are inevitable trade-offs between solutions, particularly when it comes to security. But common to each of the themes I've mentioned today is a need to reduce cognitive load, to reduce the burden of having to remember so much stuff, and just to make the web a simpler place. As we've seen, technology can come to our aid with some of this, with built-in features of browsers and operating systems and extensions, acting as a vital aide-memoire. But really, there's so much more we can do to make the web a simpler and safer place to start with, a less confusing, less distracting, less anxiety-inducing place. And that's something that, regardless of how good we consider our memory to be, I hope we never forget. Thank you for listening. My name is David Swallow. I think we've got time for questions. If you're interested in this area, I'm planning to follow this up with some blog posts, which should crystallize my thoughts a bit better. I will also be speaking on this subject at the upcoming CSUN conference in March. If you're planning to attend, do say hi.
David, I do see we got one question in the chat. Is this presentation based on what is already in WCAG 2.2 or on general best practices not yet in WCAG?
It's a mixture. Some of it is in WCAG 2.2. They're just getting there with things like the accessible authentication. A lot of it is in the making content usable document from Koga. And yeah, a lot of it is just general existing usability good practice. So yeah, it's kind of brought together from various places. But it's not all in WCAG, if that's what That's what the question was getting at.
Yeah, I think you answered the question there. I'm not taking any additional questions coming in. We'll give you guys a few more moments before we close out the webinar. Again, just want to remind everyone that the recording will be sent out in an email to anyone who registered for the webinar later this week. It will also be available to watch on demand on our website, either later this week, early next week as well. So please feel free to share that out. If you think of any questions after the fact, have anything that you're interested in speaking with one of our professionals about, you can reach out to Ida. That's IDA at tpgi.com. I'll add that email into the chat as well. Looks like we did get one additional question in here. What is better, to open a link in a new tab or in the same tab for people with poor memory?
Good question. I don't think that matters too much. Obviously, opening in a new tab, if they're then following that tab, there isn't a clear way to get back, so they couldn't use the back button there. So there's that to consider. So the same tab would have that continuity if it's sort of traditional website navigation. Go from page to page to page, and opening in the same tab. But as we're seeing, people use tabs in quite wonderful ways. So
Looks like they added specific to forms and disappearing labels. What is the preferred alternative? Labels outside of the form inputs?
Yes, sorry, yes, definitely. Visible labels that are permanent, that stay there, that don't disappear when you start typing into them. Just a traditional label element that's associated with a form field. There's float labels, but there's various issues with those. Really, not the most obvious user interface feature. A float label, when the label disappears, not disappears, goes a lot smaller, shrinks down, so it's still kind of visible, but it's not very obvious what it does. But so no, the best one is just visible labels.
So we got another question. Of respondents who use multiple tabs / windows as breadcrumbs, what workarounds would they use to mitigate previously open tabs autoplaying content?
I'm just trying to look for that. Can you say it again? Sorry, I'm trying to find it on here.
It's in the Q&A box. This one is. Of respondents who use multiple tabs / windows as breadcrumbs, what workarounds would they use to mitigate previously open tabs autoplaying content?
Oh, you can mute a tab now in a lot of browsers. I think Firefox and Chrome do that, so you can mute other tabs. Is that the situation, I imagine, where you find something's playing somewhere, and yeah, it's not on the page you're currently on?
Yeah, correct.
Can be incredibly distracting. Yeah. I think browsers now display that in the browser tab title. Usually has like a play button or a speaker button or something that indicating that that's the one that's got the audio playing. So yeah, I'm not aware of anything else, but just there's browser techniques that can support help you identify that.
So you also have, is there a document summarizing the respondent statistics?
There isn't. No. I could get that if people would like.
And then I also have, how, if at all, will user agent specific AI features or user agent agnostic NLP apps solve some of the problems you've described?
User agent specific. Um, Good as me. I don't know. Um, I mean, what kind of features and techniques are you thinking of, Koba? Um, yeah, I'd have to think about that and get back to you on that one.
Let's see. Um, Another open new window question. I was under the impression that experience could be disorienting for users and should be used sparingly. Now there's a positive spin to it. Not sure what to think. Is there a general rule of thumb to go by? And again, this question's in
Yeah,
the Q&A box there.
yeah. I would still stick with the same thing I was saying before, and for that continuity and to enable you to go back and not break the back button, then um, I would open in the same window. I mean, I suppose it depends what the purpose is. I mean, is it if it's just a link that's moving to another web page and you are literally browsing and going through that? Is it kind of like supplementary information, maybe like a sort of help guide that's opening a new window that you might want to have on the go concurrently? Um, then yeah, that might be a case for opening a new window. But I would stick to the more traditional advice there, and just open it in the same window unless there's a particularly good reason for that. And users can opt to open in new windows and change the default behavior anyway and override that. Um, so yeah, I'd keep it traditional.
So we also have any thoughts on helping users compare options with multiple points of differentiation? Example, comparing flights or hotels, especially on multiple devices when screen real estate is so limited.
Hmm. Um, no, that didn't come up in the people I've spoken to. But yeah, again, that's you're having to sort of juggle a lot of information on the go. Um, and then there's also an impact there often with these comparison things of dark deceptive patterns, which can manipulate how the information's presented to nudge you towards certain options. So though, yeah, those comparison tables are sort of fraught with issues anyway. But in terms of how to do that, I'm not aware of any particular assistance or help in dealing with those. Um, no.
See, I have also some websites with complex forms will save your partially completed form so that you can leave and come back without losing your progress. Was this an emphasis from anyone in the study? What's your opinion?
No, no one mentioned that. Surprisingly, because the whole multi-page form thing, as I say, was mentioned by a lot of people. But saving your progress, yeah, I mean that's undoubtedly going to be good. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking the different ways to do that. A survey I did recently had you, enter your email address, and it would send you a link so you can then come back to the survey at another time. I suppose that there's more streamlined ways of doing that process, but I think definitely having that as an option is ideal.
All right. It looks like I think I've gotten most of the questions. If you asked a question in the chat and we did not get to it, we will reach out to you after the webinar is over and make sure we get an answer to your question to you. And again, I'm going to add the email address into the webinar chat where you can reach Ida if you have additional questions. And one of us will respond back to you as soon as possible. I know we're coming up on our time here, so I wanted to thank David for taking the time and going through this presentation with us. Thank all of our attendees for joining us. Again, the webinar recording will go out later this week. You will also be able to access it on demand on our page. And again, if we missed your question, I apologize. We will jump back in and respond to you after the webinar is over. All right. And with that, again, thanks everyone for joining. We will see you again next time. Have a great rest of your day.
Great stuff. Thank you.